On October 12, 1983, at approximately 6:47 in the morning, a woman named Anna Harper kissed her two children goodbye, told her husband she had an early meeting at work, and walked out the front door of their suburban Virginia home carrying nothing but her purse and a single briefcase. She never came back. Her car was found 3 days later in a long-term parking lot at Dulles International Airport, keys still in the ignition, and by the time federal investigators pieced together what had happened, Anna Harper, the PTA volunteer, the devoted mother, the reliable defense contractor employee, was already thousands of miles away, sitting in a debriefing room in Moscow, sipping tea and answering questions in flawless Russian. Because Anna Harper wasn't who she said she was. She never had been. This is the story of how a Soviet intelligence officer spent nearly a decade living a double life in the heart of American suburbia, how she fed classified information back to the KGB while baking cookies for school fundraisers and attending Little League games, and how, when the walls finally began to close in, she made a choice that would haunt her family forever. It's a story about deception, ideology, and the cold calculus of espionage during one of the tensest periods in modern history. And it begins not in Virginia, but in a training facility outside Leningrad in the early 1970s, where a young woman was being prepared for a mission that would define the rest of her life. Her real name, according to declassified KGB records released decades later, was Yelena Mikhailovna Sokolova, born in 1947 in the city of Minsk, to a family with impeccable party credentials. Her father had been a mid-level bureaucrat in the Ministry of Agriculture, her mother a schoolteacher, and Yelena herself had been identified early as a promising candidate for intelligence work. She was smart, adaptable, and most importantly, she possessed an almost preternatural ability to blend in. Former instructors who trained her would later describe her as unremarkable in the best possible way, someone you could pass on the street a dozen times and never remember, someone whose face seemed to shift depending on the context, who could modulate her personality to fit whatever role was required. She spoke English with only the faintest trace of an accent, having studied the language intensively since adolescence, and by the time she graduated from the training program in 1973, she had been transformed into someone else entirely. She had a new name, a fabricated history, and a mission. The plan was straightforward, at least on paper. Yelena would enter the United States under a different identity, one that wouldn't raise suspicions at immigration, a Polish-sounding name that fit her cover story as a graduate student from Eastern Europe. She became Anna Kowalczyk, complete with a Polish passport, academic transcripts from the University of Warsaw, and a carefully constructed backstory about fleeing the communist bloc to pursue opportunities in the West. It was a credible legend. Poland had a history of citizens emigrating to America, and her explanation for why she wanted to study in the United States would seem entirely natural to immigration officials. She wasn't expected to steal nuclear secrets or photograph classified documents right away. The KGB operated on a much longer timeline than that. They were planting seeds that might not bear fruit for years, positioning assets who could provide valuable information over the course of a career, not just a single operation. And in 1974, when Yelena, now Anna Kowalczyk, arrived in New York City with a student visa and a suitcase full of carefully worn-in American clothes, she was one of dozens of similar operatives being quietly inserted into Western society, part of a vast network that stretched across continents and operated in the shadows of the Cold War. She spent her first year in the United States doing exactly what her cover story said she would do, which was attending graduate classes at a mid-tier university in New Jersey, studying electrical engineering, making friends, going to parties, learning the rhythms and textures of American life. She dated occasionally, nothing serious, and worked part-time at a campus library to supplement the modest stipend that came through a series of carefully laundered financial channels. To everyone who knew her, she was just Anna Kowalczyk, another foreign student trying to make it in America, polite but not overly friendly, diligent but not obsessive, the kind of person who faded into the background of any group photo. And that was exactly the point. In 1975, she met a man named David Harper at a community event in Princeton. David was 32, an engineer himself, recently divorced, and somewhat awkward in social situations. He worked for a mid-sized defense contractor that did business with the Department of Defense, mostly routine stuff, circuit boards and communication systems, nothing that would make headlines, but also nothing that was publicly available. They started dating in the fall of that year, and by all accounts, it was a genuine relationship, at least on David's side. He was smitten with her. Friends from that period would later say he thought she was smart and kind and refreshingly down-to-earth compared to the women he'd met in the past. Whether Anna felt the same way is impossible to know, but she played the role convincingly. They were married in April 1976 in a small ceremony attended by a handful of David's relatives and a few friends Anna had made at school. There were no guests from her side, she explained, because her family back in Poland had complications with travel visas, a detail that David accepted without question because he had no reason not to. When she became David's wife, Anna Kowalczyk became Anna Harper, and it was under this new, fully Americanized name that she would operate for the next 7 years. The marriage served multiple purposes from an operational standpoint. It gave her a deeper, more permanent cover, the kind that would be much harder to unravel if anyone ever started asking questions. The transformation from Anna Kowalczyk, Polish immigrant student, to Anna Harper, American wife and mother, provided layers of legitimacy that made her almost invisible to counterintelligence scrutiny. It also gave her access, not directly, but proximity to someone who worked in the defense industry, someone who might mention things at the dinner table or leave documents lying around the house. But more than that, it made her look legitimate in a way that a single foreign woman living alone never could in the context of 1970s America. Married women with families weren't suspected of being foreign intelligence agents. They were assumed to be exactly what they appeared to be, which was the entire point. By 1977, Anna and David had moved to a quiet neighborhood in McLean, Virginia, a suburb just outside Washington, D.C., and Anna had given birth to their first child, a daughter named Emily. A second child, a son named Michael, would arrive in early 1979. During this period, Anna was also working, having secured a position as a technical analyst at the same defense contractor that employed her husband, a company called Advanced Systems Technologies that held contracts with the Army and Navy for communications equipment. She had applied for the job in late 1976, and her background check, which included a review of her Polish immigration records and her academic credentials, came back clean. The identity that the KGB had constructed for her as Anna Kowalczyk was thorough enough to withstand scrutiny, at least the level of scrutiny that was standard at the time. And by the middle of 1977, Anna Harper had a security clearance and access to information that, while not top secret, was still classified and still valuable to a foreign intelligence service. This is where the operation shifted from long-term positioning to active intelligence gathering. Anna's role at Advanced Systems Technologies involved reviewing technical specifications and coordinating between engineering teams and government liaisons, which meant she saw a steady stream of documents related to military contracts, project timelines, equipment capabilities, and budget allocations. Most of it was mundane, the kinds of details that wouldn't mean much to the average person. But to an intelligence analyst in Moscow, even mundane details could be useful. They revealed patterns, priorities, weaknesses in supply chains, gaps in technological capabilities. And so Anna began the careful, methodical process of passing information back to her handlers. The mechanics of this were deliberately low-tech and slow-paced. She didn't photograph documents or copy files onto microfilm, at least not often, because the risk of being caught in the act was too high. Instead, she memorized details, wrote summaries in coded language, and passed them along during brief, carefully orchestrated meetings with a contact who operated under diplomatic cover at the Soviet embassy in Washington. These meetings, known in intelligence parlance as brush passes, took place in public locations, parks, shopping centers, museum lobbies, places where two people could briefly cross paths without arousing suspicion. Sometimes she would leave materials in a dead drop, a pre-arranged hiding spot where her contact could retrieve them later, a loose brick in a garden wall, a hollowed-out tree stump in Rock Creek Park, locations that had been scouted and tested long before she ever used them. For years, this system worked. Anna passed information, not constantly, but regularly, a report here, a set of specifications there, and the KGB received what they considered to be a steady trickle of useful intelligence. It wasn't groundbreaking material, nothing that would change the course of the Cold War, but it was solid, reliable, and it came from a source who had proven herself to be disciplined and cautious. Back in Virginia, Anna's life continued along its predictable suburban trajectory. She attended parent-teacher conferences, hosted birthday parties, volunteered at the elementary school library. She and David had a routine. He worked long hours. She managed the household and her own job. And on weekends, they did what other families did: trips to the zoo, dinners at chain restaurants, home improvement projects. By all outward appearances, they were living the American dream. But beneath the surface, the strain was immense. Living a double life is not like flipping a switch between two identities. It's a constant state of performance, a mental and emotional tightrope walk that never ends. Every conversation, every interaction, every casual question from a neighbor or a co-worker had to be filtered through the lens of the cover story, evaluated for risk, responded to in a way that was consistent with Anna Harper's fabricated history. And then there was the reality of what she was doing, which was betraying the trust of everyone around her, including her husband and her children. Whether she felt guilt about this is unknown. Former Soviet intelligence officers who have spoken publicly about similar operations describe a mindset in which ideology and duty override personal feelings. But it's hard to imagine that there weren't moments, late at night or early in the morning, when the weight of it all became difficult to bear. By the early 1980s, the intelligence landscape was shifting. The Cold War, which had been a relatively stable, if tense, equilibrium for much of the 1970s, was entering a more aggressive phase. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 had ratcheted up tensions, and the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980 brought a new, more confrontational approach to U.S. foreign policy. At the same time, American counterintelligence agencies were becoming more sophisticated, more paranoid, and more focused on rooting out Soviet operatives who had embedded themselves in American institutions. The FBI's counterintelligence division was expanding, New technologies were being deployed to monitor communications and track suspicious activity, and there was a growing awareness within the intelligence community that the Soviets had likely placed long-term sleeper agents in positions throughout government and industry. Anna, who had been operating for nearly a decade by this point, was still considered a valuable asset by her handlers, but the KGB was also aware that the longer an operative stayed in place, the greater the risk of exposure. Time was not on her side, and the demands being placed on her were increasing. In 1982, she was instructed to obtain more detailed information about a specific project that Advanced Systems Technologies was working on, a communications encryption system that was being developed for use by NATO forces in Europe. This was a step up from the routine reports she had been providing. It was a priority target, something that Moscow wanted badly enough to justify taking greater risks. And so, Anna took those risks. She began staying late at the office, volunteering for additional assignments that would give her access to the relevant files. She made copies of documents when she could do so without being observed, photographing them with a tiny camera that her handler had provided. The kind of equipment that seems almost quaint now, but was cutting-edge tradecraft at the time. She passed these materials along through her usual channels, and for a few months, it seemed like the operation was succeeding. But then, in the spring of 1983, something went wrong. The exact nature of the mistake has never been fully confirmed, but according to information that emerged years later, it involved a document that Anna had photocopied and then failed to return to its proper place. It was a small error, the kind of thing that might have gone unnoticed under different circumstances, but in this case, someone noticed. A security officer conducting a routine audit of classified materials flagged the discrepancy, which triggered a deeper review, which in turn led to questions about who had accessed the file and when. Anna's name came up in that review, not as the primary suspect, not at first, but as someone who had been in the area during the relevant time frame. This was the beginning of the end, though Anna didn't know it immediately. The FBI, which had been notified of the potential security breach, began a quiet, methodical investigation. They reviewed access logs, interviewed employees, and started building a timeline of who had been where and when. Anna's name continued to appear in the background of this investigation, never quite at the center, but always present, always just slightly off, in ways that were hard to articulate but impossible to ignore. And then one of the investigators, a veteran counterintelligence agent named Richard Callahan, who had spent his entire career chasing Soviet spies, noticed something odd about Anna Harper's background. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a small inconsistency in her employment history, a gap of a few months in 1974 that didn't quite line up with what she had claimed on her security clearance forms. Callahan pulled the file and started digging, cross-referencing her records with other databases, reaching out to contacts at other agencies, and the more he looked, the more the inconsistencies began to pile up. Her Polish passport and immigration records, when examined closely, had irregularities that suggested they might be sophisticated forgeries. Her academic records from the University of Warsaw were difficult to verify through normal channels. And when Callahan tried to track down people who would have known her during her time in Poland before coming to America, he came up empty. It was as if Anna Kowalczyk had simply materialized in 1974, fully formed with no real history before that. By the summer of 1983, the FBI had opened a full counterintelligence investigation into Anna Harper, and while they didn't yet have proof that she was a Soviet agent, they had enough circumstantial evidence to justify surveillance. Her phone was tapped, her movements were monitored, and agents began quietly interviewing people in her life, asking vague questions about her behavior, her habits, her background. David Harper was not informed of this investigation, at least not initially, because the FBI didn't want to risk tipping Anna off, and they also weren't entirely sure that David wasn't complicit. As far as they were concerned, everyone in Anna's orbit was a potential suspect until proven otherwise. For several months, the surveillance produced nothing conclusive. Anna, if she was indeed a spy, was being extremely careful. She went to work, came home, took care of her kids, attended school functions, and gave no outward indication that she was aware of being watched. But in September 1983, something changed. One of the FBI's surveillance teams observed Anna making an unscheduled trip to Washington, D.C. on a Saturday afternoon, telling her husband she needed to run errands. She drove to a shopping center in Georgetown, parked, and spent approximately 40 minutes walking through various stores. And during that time, she briefly crossed paths with a man who was later identified as a known Soviet intelligence officer operating under diplomatic cover. The interaction lasted less than 10 seconds, just long enough for the two of them to pass within a few feet of each other. And to the surveillance team, it looked like a brush pass, a moment where materials or information could have been exchanged without anyone noticing. This was the evidence the FBI had been waiting for. Not enough to make an arrest, not yet, but enough to confirm that their suspicions were justified. The investigation intensified immediately. More resources were allocated, more agents were brought in, and the surveillance became tighter, more comprehensive. The plan was to watch Anna until she made contact with her handler again, gather enough evidence to build an airtight case, and then arrest her in a way that would allow the FBI to roll up the entire network she was connected to. But they underestimated how closely Anna's own handlers were monitoring the situation, and they underestimated how quickly the KGB could react when they sensed that one of their operatives was in danger. In early October 1983, Anna received a signal from her handler, an emergency message delivered through a prearranged method that indicated she needed to leave the country immediately. The details of how this signal was transmitted remain unclear, but the most likely explanation is that it came through a coded message in a newspaper advertisement or a brief phone call using a pre-established code phrase. Whatever the method, the message was unmistakable. Her cover was blown. The Americans were closing in, and she needed to extract herself before it was too late. And so, on the morning of October 12th, Anna Harper made the decision that would define the rest of her life and the lives of everyone she left behind. She woke up early, got her children ready for school, made breakfast for David, and acted as if it were just another ordinary day. She told David she had an early meeting at work, which wasn't unusual. She kissed Emily and Michael goodbye, which also wasn't unusual, and she walked out the door, carrying her purse and a briefcase. Inside that briefcase, according to what investigators later pieced together, was approximately $15,000 in cash, a set of false identity documents that had been provided by the KGB years earlier for exactly this kind of emergency, and probably very little else. She left behind her wedding ring, family photos, personal belongings, everything that connected her to the life she had built over the previous 9 years. She drove her car to Dulles International Airport, parked it in a long-term lot, and abandoned it there with the keys in the ignition. From there, she likely took a taxi or a shuttle to a different location, changed clothes, and used her false documents to board a series of flights that would eventually take her out of the country. The exact route she took has never been fully confirmed, but intelligence analysts believe she flew first to Mexico City, then on to Havana, and from there to Moscow. The entire journey would have taken less than 48 hours, and by the time the FBI realized she was gone, she was already beyond their reach, sitting in a safe house in the Soviet Union, being debriefed by KGB officers who wanted to know everything she had learned during her years in America. Back in Virginia, David Harper came home from work on October 12th to find his wife missing. At first, he assumed she was running late, or that she had decided to go out after work without telling him. It was only when evening turned into night, and she still hadn't come home or called, that he began to worry. He tried calling her office, but no one had seen her. He called friends, but no one knew where she was. By the next morning, he reported her missing to the police, and that's when the FBI stepped in and informed him that his wife was not who he thought she was, and that she was almost certainly never coming back. The revelation was devastating, not just to David, but to everyone who had known Anna Harper. Her co-workers were stunned, her neighbors were in disbelief, and her children, Emily and Michael, who were 6 and 4 years old respectively at the time their mother disappeared, were left with questions that would never be fully answered. David Harper, for his part, cooperated fully with the FBI's investigation, submitting to multiple interviews, allowing agents to search his home, providing access to financial records and personal documents. The FBI concluded eventually that David had been an unwitting victim, a man who had genuinely believed he was married to a woman named Anna Kowalczyk, who became Anna Harper, and had no idea that his wife was a Soviet spy. But that conclusion didn't ease the pain or the humiliation of having been deceived so completely. And in the years that followed, David Harper largely withdrew from public life, moving to a different state with his children and attempting to rebuild a life that had been shattered by betrayal. The FBI's investigation into Anna Harper, or Yelena Sokolova, continued for years after her disappearance, but it yielded little in the way of additional intelligence. The Soviet contact she had been working with was expelled from the United States as part of a broader diplomatic response, but he was quickly replaced by someone else, and the network she had been part of remained largely intact. The classified information she had stolen was assessed for damage, and while it was determined that some of her reporting had been valuable to the Soviets, none of it was deemed catastrophic. She had been a competent spy, but not a brilliant one, and the intelligence she provided, while useful, had not fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Cold War. As for Yelena herself, she disappeared into the Soviet system and was never heard from again, at least not publicly. There are unconfirmed reports that she was given a new identity, possibly a new assignment, and that she continued working for Soviet intelligence in some capacity, but nothing has ever been verified. Some former intelligence officers who defected from the Soviet Union in later years claimed to have heard of her, describing her as a cautionary tale used in KGB training programs, an example of an operative who had successfully maintained cover for nearly a decade, but who had ultimately been forced to abandon everything because of a single mistake. Whether she ever thought about the family she left behind, whether she felt regret or guilt or anything at all, is unknown. The one certainty is that she never attempted to contact David, Emily, or Michael. Not once. Not ever. The case of Anna Harper, or Yelena Sokolova, is not unique in the history of Cold War espionage, but it is emblematic of a particular kind of operation that the Soviet Union excelled at: the long-term, deep cover agent, someone who could burrow into American society, build a life, establish relationships, and patiently gather intelligence over the course of years, or even decades. These operatives were not flashy. They were not James Bond figures stealing nuclear codes and escaping in sports cars. They were patient, methodical, and willing to sacrifice enormous amounts of time and energy for marginal gains. And the psychological toll of this work was immense because it required not just deception, but sustained, comprehensive deception, the kind that turns a person's entire life into a performance. What makes this story particularly haunting is not the espionage itself, but the human cost. David Harper had to reckon with the fact that the woman he had loved, the mother of his children, had never been real, or at least the version of her that he had known had been a carefully constructed lie. Emily and Michael Harper grew up without their mother, and with the knowledge that she had chosen to abandon them rather than face the consequences of her actions. And Yelena Sokolova, wherever she ended up, had to live with the fact that she had left behind two children who would grow up asking questions she would never answer. The broader implications of the case were significant as well. Anna Harper's escape highlighted serious vulnerabilities in American security clearance procedures and background check processes, vulnerabilities that the FBI and other agencies scrambled to address in the aftermath of her disappearance. It also reinforced the paranoia that permeated counterintelligence work during the Cold War. The understanding that Soviet operatives could be anywhere, embedded in any institution, living seemingly normal lives while working against American interests. This paranoia was not entirely unjustified, as subsequent revelations about other Soviet agents who operated in the United States during this period would later confirm, but it also contributed to an atmosphere of suspicion and mistrust that affected countless innocent people who found themselves under investigation simply because they fit a profile or had an unusual background. In the years since the Cold War ended, some details about Yelena Sokolova's operation have emerged through declassified documents and interviews with former intelligence officers, but much of her story remains shrouded in secrecy. The KGB's archives, to the extent that they still exist and are accessible, contain information that has never been made public, and it's likely that the full truth about her mission, her motivations, and her ultimate fate will never be known. What is known, however, is that she was part of a vast, shadowy conflict that played out not just on the global stage, but in suburban living rooms and corporate offices and elementary school parking lots, a conflict in which the stakes were measured not just in geopolitical terms, but in the shattered lives of people who got caught in the crossfire. The question that lingers, the question that has never been satisfactorily answered, is what Yelena Sokolova believed she was fighting for. Was she a true believer in communist ideology, someone who genuinely thought that the Soviet Union represented a better future for humanity, and that her work, however morally compromising, was in service of that vision? Or was she simply a product of a system that identified her as useful and shaped her into a tool, someone who followed orders because that was what she had been trained to do, without thinking too deeply about the consequences? The truth is probably somewhere in between, a mixture of ideology, duty, and the kind of compartmentalization that allows people to do terrible things while still thinking of themselves as fundamentally good. What is undeniable is that she made a choice, and that choice had consequences that rippled outward in ways she could not have fully anticipated. David Harper spent years in therapy, trying to process what had happened to him, trying to rebuild his sense of trust and identity after having been so thoroughly deceived. Emily Harper, who was old enough to have some memories of her mother, grew up with a complicated mix of anger and confusion, never quite able to reconcile the woman she remembered, the woman who had read her bedtime stories and braided her hair, with the woman who had abandoned her without a second thought. Michael Harper, who was too young to remember much of anything, grew up with an absence, a hole in his life where a mother should have been, and the knowledge that she had chosen to leave him behind. In the end, the story of Yelena Sokolova is a story about the cost of deception, about what happens when ideology and duty collide with human relationships, and about the ways in which the Cold War, for all its geopolitical complexity, came down to individual people making individual choices, some of which were heroic, some of which were tragic, and some of which were simply incomprehensible. It's a story that doesn't have a neat resolution or a clear moral, because the reality of espionage, especially during that era, was messy and morally ambiguous, and the people involved were rarely purely good or purely evil. They were just people, caught up in something larger than themselves, trying to navigate impossible situations with incomplete information and conflicting loyalties. Anna Harper walked out of her house on a Friday morning in October 1983 and never came back, and the echoes of that decision are still reverberating decades later in the lives of the people she left behind, in the archives of intelligence agencies that are still trying to understand what she did and why, and in the history of a conflict that defined an entire generation. She became a ghost, a shadow, a cautionary tale, and whatever life she built for herself after that morning, it was a life lived in the knowledge that she had betrayed everyone who had ever trusted her, and that there was no going back, not ever. The case remains technically open, though it's unlikely that any new information will emerge at this point. David Harper passed away in 2019, having never remarried, and having spent the latter part of his life as a quietly bitter man who rarely spoke about his past. Emily and Michael Harper, now in their late 40s, have both declined requests for interviews over the years, preferring to leave the past where it is. And Yelena Sokolova, if she's still alive, would be in her late 70s now, living somewhere in the former Soviet Union under a name that no one knows, carrying with her the memory of a life she once lived and a family she once had, and the understanding that none of it was ever real, or at least not in the way it should have been. This is the story of the woman who vanished, and the lives she left behind, and the questions that will never be answered.